Welcome to What's a Beautiful Life Anyway? I'm your host, Jill Bennett. This is the channel that shares ideas to help you live your best life, because life can be beautiful if you live consciously. Welcome to this episode of What's a Beautiful Life Anyway? Now, we all know to live our best and most beautiful life, we want to be in the best health we possibly can. Just imagine being given a diagnosis of ME, CFS and fibromyalgia, and spending the following 24 years predominantly bedbound, often in a wheelchair, and living daily with chronic bone, muscle and joint pain, extreme fatigue and cognitive processing struggles. That's exactly what happened to this week's guest, Alison Petty. Welcome, Alison.
Hi, Jill. Welcome. Thank you so much for your lovely warm welcome. I appreciate it.
It's really lovely to have you here, because stories like this, where people have been on an incredible journey, are just so inspiring, and we always hope that it's going to help someone. Even if it's one tiny spark of information in this that helps someone, it's always for the better. Now, your transformational journey began in 2016, so tell us what happened.
Yeah, so as you just gave that little nutshell of the beginning of the illness, so it's 24 years, as I always say, predominantly bedbound and in a wheelchair, often at times on things like morphine or Valium for that chronic bone, joint, muscle pain that you mentioned, and the cognitive struggles as well, but particularly the chronic pain. But in 2016, so I always say, I'm a transformational coach because my journey is very much about transformation. So it was in 2016 where I attended a NLP-based training program, which is neuro-linguistic programming. And this particular course is called the Lightning Process. And that was my transformation. And it's that kind of, phrase like life-changing. It absolutely was. So in 24 years, along with the amazing support of my family, tried every alternative therapy that I could access, and also all the medications, but they usually made me feel a lot worse because of side effects and things like that. And just in my experience, things work differently for different people, but I never found anything. And I tried everything from nutrition to Reiki to reflexology to healing, everything in between, Chinese medicine, and nothing touched it until I went on this course. And NLP literally did not just give me my feet back, but gave me my entire life back in ways I never could have imagined possible at that time, because it had by that point been 24 years of trying what I thought was everything. And there was a very, dark tunnel ahead of me, but this was everything that changed it for me.
Yeah, life-changing. And I mean, we'll come into a lot of this during this process, but it shows so many people say this therapy doesn't work or healing doesn't work or whatever, but it's because of their mindset, it's because of what they're open to. And, it's brilliant that you do this sort of coaching. You had such a dramatic change from a wheelchair to rock climbing. And yeah, we know the mind is such a powerful thing, and we are self-fulfilling prophecies at the end of the day. So do you feel that if you'd learned what you did when you did the NLP training, if you'd learned that earlier, do you think you would have recovered sooner?
Absolutely. I mean, I always, and obviously now this is what I now do for other people. I'm an advanced master practitioner of all these, NLP coaching, hypnotherapy, and I also now know for my clients they have to be in the right place to, and especially when it comes to things like NLP and understanding mindset, that we can change. And that is neurology, that's our neuroplasticity, and it is changeable. We're not talking about magic here. But if somebody comes to me and they don't believe it's possible to change, then it's kind of a non-starter, or you have to work with that first. But for me, I know I was always that kind of person anyway. I just didn't know of NLP. Didn't have that understanding of all these things that were possible at the time. But knowing how I've been throughout my life, yeah, if it happened 12 years sooner, I always say I wish it had been 12 years. 24 years is a long time, no regrets and all that. But if I had done it, say, 12 years earlier, I think I'd still have an inspiring story to go out and, help other people understand that these things are possible with. And it just would have been a little less time for me. But, these things happen the way they happen. And, but yes, absolutely. For me, it's like, if you're in a place where you're ready to make the change and you're open to it, some understanding of how it works helps, but if you don't understand how it works, that also works. You just have to be open to it and go with the person who's guiding you.
Yeah, yeah, it's with hindsight and whatever, yeah, it would be nice to think it could have happened earlier. But then we have to say that everything happens for a reason, and
Exactly.
believe that everything happens for a reason. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, absolutely.
yeah,
And I still had a life. I mean, I lived a life. It just, when although I say that, and then I think, well, there was an 8 year period in my late 20s to early 30s where I was pretty much bedbound and in a wheelchair. And the last 4 years from 2012 to 16, I was pretty much in a dark room in bed. So, but there were periods of time where I could function. I just always, and I do mean the word always, because in NLP, when someone says, "Oh, I always feel like this," like always, and then you're just like, "Oh, no, maybe not." It's always one of our little things we do. But I cannot think of a time in those 24 years where I didn't have symptoms on one level or another, even if they were mild, but they were always there.
yeah,
So whatever I was doing, they were present, and then I would relapse because that's what happens with that particular kind of, or those particular kind of chronic illnesses. You do something and you relapse, get payback. You do something, you get payback, whether it's for a week or 8 years.
mm. Yes, it's so difficult to imagine. How can we keep our minds positive? We all know we've got that little chimp or that little psycho parrot, I've heard it called, where you might want to do something and you're like, oh, I can't do that, or who do I think that I can do that, or you're not good enough, or whatever it is. How can we keep those voices out of our head and stay positive?
Oh, the short answer, there isn't. I mean, I can give you some short answers to it, but obviously that's like, it's quite a big question, isn't it? I mean, it always begins with awareness for me. Just having that awareness of hearing those voices, and if we're not hearing those voices, then we're just living in a state of like autopilot. And we definitely all go through those times in our lives, but when you can sort of learn to bring awareness in, whether that's through because you're doing mindfulness practice or you're just somebody who is aware of those voices. Um, and there's lots of different ways. I mean, for me, anyone that follows what I do, I'm always talking about the power of language. So it's learning how to harness your language in a way that serves you, because your brain is listening to your language all the time. Everything you're speaking, whether it's external, but particularly that internal narrative. And then this sort of starts to go into other levels, because that internal narrative sometimes is from something in the moment, but more often than not, it's old narratives that are from the past, and also narratives that actually don't even belong to us. So that gets even another level of, it could be a narrative like, you're reacting to something. And when you really check in with that, this is something I do with clients a lot, when you actually check in with that quite strong reaction to something, every now and again, that will be an appropriate reaction that you would be like, no, this is an appropriate reaction in this moment. For me, 9 times out of 10, when I check in, I'm like, no, I'm actually okay about this thing. That's my granddad's. That's the way I learned from him, or EastEnders, or society, because in British people react, like this, whereas an American person would react very differently to the same thing. So there's all kinds of things like that. But for me, this kind of stuff, when you're not working with a practitioner and you're talking about stuff you can do, by yourself at home, it's learning how to harness that language and use it and put your words in the right order, ask your brain the right kind of questions. So rather than saying, why am I always so bad at, saving money? Why do I never have any money? Because your brain will go off and be like, right, what's the answers to that question? And it will come back, and, because you've got a rubbish job, because you hate your job, because, life, because everything sucks so much, there's no point, and I'm a loser, and all those kinds of things, horrible things. Whereas if you ask saying, you wanted to get to the same outcome, but you ask it in different ways, like, what could I do to start saving money? What could I do to start looking after my financial independence? Again, the brain will go off and it will come back with, right, well, you could look for a better job that makes you really happy and makes you want to get out of bed in the morning. You could go to the bank and talk to them about a savings account. It will just come back with lots of really constructive ways to answer that question. So it's things like that. But again, it's just watching the language and noticing when it's negative or passive, and just changing it. So you could say something like, rather than saying, I have to do this job interview next week, and perhaps it's one you're not looking forward to or nervous about, naturally you would probably say, I have to go to that interview next week. And that feels quite weighted and heavy. But you could change that, I would suggest, to, I get to do this job interview next week. Immediately your brain picks up on, oh, we get to go and do something. And yeah, again, 9 times out of 10, that if you're saying you get to, that 9 times out of 10 means it's going to be something exciting. that doesn't you tend to follow have to. That comes with a weight. So again, it's changing that and noticing how that changes that feeling about the event or the person or whatever that is, in your physiology, because you start to feel different because your brain starts releasing good chemicals and then you start to feel different. And yeah, but it takes work. I mean, for me, I'm always very careful to explain, that, getting out of the wheelchair, I didn't just think myself better. There's a physiological thing that went on there. I was just using my brain and my neurology to access that. And it was the hardest work I ever did, but it was the best work I ever did. And I always say it to my clients, it's not the change will happen in the session like that, but that continuation of it, they have to go away. And it's like monitoring that language and learning, yeah, just keeping that mindfulness awareness of it. And it's habit, it's practice. I always say, if you once learned to tie your shoelace when you were fine at 5, and the fact that you're now running out the door and not tripping over it means that you kept practicing and practicing. And one day, when you were 5, you were running out the door and not tripping over it and saying goodbye to your mum and not even thinking about it. It's the same neurology, we're just using it in a much bigger way now.
Yeah, and a really good example of that is learning to drive a car, isn't it? We all know
Exactly,
how
absolutely.
difficult it is to
Mm,
remember the gears and the clutch and the
yeah.
accelerator and the brake and everything. But once you've passed your test and driven around for a few weeks, it's second nature. It's
You're
there.
not, yeah, you're thinking about the song that's playing on the radio, you're thinking
Yeah,
about, the person you're going to go and visit, and you're just somehow getting there, safely. But it's that, you've just created those automatic habits, and your brain has just started like creating these connections, and then you just do it without even thinking. And you can think about it, you don't learn Spanish in 1 hour. You have to practice and go away and learn and learn and learn
yeah.
and
Oh,
repeat,
tell me
repeat,
about
repeat.
it.
Yeah.
I'm learning at the moment.
Okay.
I
Yeah,
do.
I'm
I
sure.
spend time every day, usually about at least 30 minutes, often an hour a day.
Yeah.
And I'm going over the same thing again and again because that way it's
Absolutely.
cemented into my mind. So
Yeah,
there's a great equation by John Assaraf where he says E plus R equals O, and it stands for there's an event, and if you add on to it your reaction to it, it will determine the outcome. And I
oh, I
think
love that.
that's brilliant,
That's,
isn't it?
yeah.
Because you're absolutely right. How you get cut up in traffic, and so many people will react in a violent or
Yeah.
an upset way, but
Mm,
you're not going to change what's happened. So,
no.
I quite often just go, as if to say, what have you done that for?
Exactly. I always, I mean, on my website, if people do go and look, there's on my free downloads, there is a reaction reality check response thing that I have. It's just a worksheet that just talks through how to, very simply, when you're in that moment, connect in, ask yourself, what's the answer? If it is yours, great, but if it's not, then what you do about that. And I say to my clients, your response is the precursor to what comes next.
Yeah,
So, in that moment, like, do you want in a week's time to still be having a drama about this thing and it feeling really bad? The thing's going to happen, So I'll give you an example. I've got a really lovely television here. I'm very non-materialistic, but this is my kind of guilty pleasure. And a couple of weeks ago, I pulled the light over by accident, obviously, and it fell into the telly, left a couple of big scratches. But in that moment, I mean, that's quite a big deal for me. And I think a year ago, even, I probably would be, 6 months, and I probably would have even swapped. Like, it's expensive telly. I probably would have thought, well, I could sell it or buy a new one because that's just going to annoy me every time I look at it. And I'm not going to be able to. I'm a big film and music fan, movie fan, like huge. And yeah, but in that moment, I caught it and I just I had that moment of like, oh my God. And then I tried to rub it and I was like, nope, that's definitely 2 big scratches. But then I started laughing and I was like, okay, how do I want to feel about this? Even by tomorrow, what I want my narrative to be. And I just held it and I just paused and I just waited and I was like, okay, this is just the telly, this is all good. And you can have that moment of like, being annoyed with yourself, and it's not ideal. I'm not pretending that it was all great and rosy, but it had happened. It's like, well, where do I want this to go? Do I want to still be crying about this in a month's time and not being able to watch my telly and spending another 700 quid or whatever on a new one and then not selling this for that much because it's got a scratch in it? I was like, no. And amazing. I can't actually believe it. I watch this thing like every night, my favorite shows on it. I'm not even aware it's there until I think about it and then I can't even see it. And I'm really proud of that, and I will keep this telly because those scratches will be my reminder
Yeah.
of how powerful it is to pause that response
Yeah.
and decide in that moment what I want my narrative to be around this in a
Yeah.
week from now.
Yeah. And that's really good advice. Is it going to matter in a week? Is it going to matter is it going to matter in a year? No,
Mm.
it's not. And do I, really want to lose any stress and raise my blood pressure over this? It's not worth it.
No, and obviously, there are times where things do matter, and I always say to clients as well, bereavement, somebody
Yeah.
tells you they're going to divorce you. There's moments in life that are really big, and I wouldn't for a minute say, oh, just hold that, don't have a reaction, and just see how, it's like, no, you're going to have a very strong reaction to those moments. But it's the ones that are like, you get cut up by someone in a car, or your light falls into your telly, or you know, I don't know, you rip your favorite jumper. It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
those
But I
moments.
think even with some of the life-changing ones, like, someone leaving you or a
Mhm.
bereavement, I mean, with bereavements, I always try and, especially when it's an older person, I always think, do you know what, they've had a fantastic life. And quite often you can think of someone they've lost before that they're then going to be reunited with them. Or, most people I know who've gone through a divorce have always gone on to bigger and better things.
Oh,
So
absolutely. Yeah,
I
absolutely.
agree with you. In the moment, there is
In
going to
that
be
moment, yeah, there's
upset.
got to be a bit of processing of something that's a really big dramatic shift. But then, how long do you then want? You don't want to be, um, still crying the same amount over a divorce
No.
a year later. You want to be living your life. But it's, yeah, in those moments, yeah.
In those moments, yeah. Now, we've already sort of touched on how sometimes our reaction to things can be based, it's not our reaction, it's a relative, it's a parent,
You,
it's someone you see regularly on TV or a boss.
yeah.
So these are sort of limiting beliefs that we have in our subconscious mind. Tell me a bit more about what a limiting belief
Oh, I
is.
love limiting beliefs. They're great. We talk about them as being, well, from NLP anyway, these lies that are masquerading as truths. So, we pick up these limiting beliefs all through our life, again, from, just well-meaning parents, or, not so well-meaning families and friends, being bullied, all kinds of things. And then, again, through media, endlessly, through politics, all these different ways around us. But we carry them with us, and they become our, again, on autopilot. We're not choosing. I'm not, I've never gone, oh, that's a great limiting belief, I'm going to carry that with me for the rest of my life. I mean, I've certainly have had, and I'm dealing with ones that I still have. But again, they're just stories, they're just narratives, they're programs, however you want to say it. Um, and what I love doing with that with clients is, shining a spotlight on them for the lie that they are, because that's really what they are. And when somebody has that revelation, it can shift their world to such a degree that, they start moving in a different direction, because they're now free from that mental construct that this thing is a truth, and they have to, they then aren't able to move through that situation in the way that they would, because also as well, I think, there isn't just one set of limiting beliefs that we all have, and we're also not born with them. We
No.
pick them up through our life. So my limiting beliefs are different to yours. So you'd look at mine and be like, oh, that's not appropriate for who you are. And I'd say the same to you. No, what are you talking about? But to us, they are very strong, and they stop us from living our lives. But when we can have that spotlight or floodlight shone on it and expose it for that lie, that just dismantles the whole thing. And it's just like, oh, hang on, okay, yeah, no, of course, that's not true.
Sometimes though, it's really hard to work out what your limiting belief is, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah,
that's
it can be. It
hard.
can be. Yeah, like, yeah. I mean, absolutely, and that obviously that's where people like coaches come in, practitioners of things like NLP, because we're trained to help people. I always talk about fact finding. I always do that in my first session with clients. There's a bit of fact finding going on. I'm looking for those things. I'm looking for the things that somebody might say, and they might well come to me thinking that this is what their problem is, and they're gonna, and that might be the overriding problem. But there'll be something they'll say at some point. I'm like, oh, hang on,
Yeah,
that's really key. And then we start to look at that, and then the emotion comes, and blah blah. And they hadn't realised. Other times, clients will come and they'll just, they'll say, I have I feel worthless. You know, I had a client today that was like worthless was the big thing, but she went from like a big, huge 0 to 10 being the best you could feel about something, 0 being the opposite. In that hour session, she went from a huge 0, she called it, not just a 0, to an 8 out of 10. So just by the particular NLP process I was using, but just changing what that word meant to her. And it will, again, it will mean something different to her as to what it will mean to me, as to what it will mean to you, to what it will mean to Joe Biden, you know, all these different people, their versions of that word and the construct. But you can change that with guidance, as I say, and turn it into something that serves you better. Or, you know.
Yeah. Just as a side note, men and women, I find, I don't know whether you've found this, that they are so different in their limiting beliefs, i.e., men have very few and women have much, much more. Do you find that?
Kind of, I know what you mean by that, for sure. I think, you know, obviously all of our clients are different, have been different, but I don't really. Somebody was asking me recently about, do I find a difference in working with women to men? And the clients I've had so far, I don't really. And it tends to pretty much confidence, lack of worth comes into it very, very quickly. And that's with the men too.
Mm.
In regards to limiting beliefs, I do know what you mean, and I think there will be a truth behind that of, um, it's not something I would even begin to argue against,
Yeah,
because
I think
you know,
it comes apparent when you look at statistics of the number of women who will never lie on their CV and will, if they're
yeah,
asked, my daughter's looking for, she graduated last year and she's looking for a career. And with her, there was a job she could have applied for. She said, but I've got no experience in that. And I said, it doesn't matter. You've got experience in everything else they want. You just say openly in your application that I have all this experience. I've never experienced that, but I'm, very open to learning.
very fast learner. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Whereas a man
Whereas
would
a
come in,
man would be completely
and when
different.
we say a man, we're generalizing a bit
We
there.
are generalizing.
Many men would go in. There are men that I know and have worked with that wouldn't, but of course, but yeah, it's like the thing, I'm starting to do a lot more work with traumas now, which is really interesting and exciting for me. It's like, men tend to not be able to talk about things more than women. But again, I know a lot of men that can and are, my clients are very, very open and say things afterwards. I'm like, wow, that's like really cool that they were able to say that to me, because it was a guy. Whereas a woman, it wouldn't occur to me after a session, be like, wow, she really said some weird stuff to me. Not like, yeah, just like kind of crazy, like human stuff. But when guys do it, I'm like, oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Oh, we've talked a lot about NLP, neuro linguistic, I can't say it, linguistic
Neurolinguistic program.
programming.
Yeah.
What is NLP?
Well, I was going to say, should I, yeah, explain what it is, try
Yeah.
and do it in a nutshell. So, as I was said to you, if it's okay to share this, but on my website, there's a lot more information about this. So if they go on alisonpetty.com, that's Alison with one L, Petty with two T's, so Petty, .com. There's a video on my story page, and it's written as well, but I talk a lot more, and there's a 20-minute video on my YouTube channel where I go into much better longer explanation of what NLP is, what neuroplasticity is, and also how I got well. Because as I say, it wasn't just a case of thinking myself well. I was essentially switching off the fight or flight response, which I'd been in for years, and that was causing something that's known as an allostatic load. So when you're in constant fight or flight, which most people in modern society are to some degree, that fight or flight that really served our ancestors well, the prehistoric days, to save us from the tiger. You go in the fight or flight, you'd have the chemicals, so like, the adrenaline, cortisol to, fight or run. But then that would switch off and you go back to campfire. Whereas nowadays, majority of people, as I say, to one degree or another, are in fluctuations of fight or flight. With chronic illness like mine, I was in an extreme state, which now when I look back and I understand all this, and given that this is the only thing in 24 years that, not, as I say, not just got me a bit well, but I've been, rock climbing and mountain hiking and beyond crazy things. When I switched that off, and it took a few months, but from the very first day, I learned this technique and started to do it. I was never in a wheelchair again, but more importantly, I never relapsed again. So over the course of about 5 or 6 to 8 months, I just went on this like very steady upward in terms of my health. There was no more relapsing. But what I was doing over that time was daily doing this particular technique, which is designed to switch off the fight or flight for these types of things. And when you switch that off, because mine was very extreme, it took, 24 years, it took a bunch of months, but essentially you reduce that load of chemicals. And underneath that, what I found was I did indeed have a very healthy body, which all the medical tests over the years said that I did. Except at the same time, the doctors were saying, my test results were negative, and I had many over the years. But at the same time, they'd hand me a prescription for morphine, or codeine. And it's like, well, that's not matching up.
No.
So what I found, over these months was that I was actually healthy, except I'd had this very extreme load of chemicals that were constantly being, because my fight or flight was in a malfunctioning state. So that's all good and done now. So NLP, so yes, on my website, there's a lot more about that if people are interested in how that worked. But N stands for neurons, which are little, awesome little neurons in your brain that are constantly firing and wiring on everything you do, everything you say, wherever you're looking, whatever you're doing, and you're, learning to tie your shoelace, learning to drive, all those kinds of things. And they fire these little electrical kind of signals. And each time you learn something new, they fire faster and faster until they create these solid connections. And that's when, you are running out the door and you're not tripping over your lace because you've got it. So that's your, very, very short, your neurons. And we have billions of these in our brains. And they are changing throughout the course of our life. So neuroplasticity is is your neurons. Plasticity is changeable. And scientists used to think that our brains stopped changing in our late teens, but we now know that our brains are changing throughout our lives. If somebody in their 90s is learning to paint for the first time in their life, some new skill, that means that their neuroplasticity is still functioning, still working. L stands for linguistics, which is your language. So that's obviously your external language. And, we know how impacting language can be when people say things to us, both positively and negatively, and how we can affect others. But more importantly, that internal dialogue, that narrative that goes on in the brain. So it's learning, as I said earlier, about learning how to use that to our advantage and create what I call our roadmap for our brain, which at the moment, before you start working with someone like me, you'll have a roadmap, but it will be created on autopilot again, and it will be the one that sends you off into all these not great places.
Yeah.
But you start to create one consciously and congruently. You start to create the one you want to have that will take you in the direction you want to go, and your brain will follow and take you in that direction. And P stands for programming, which, if you imagine your brain is a computer, which as the muscle part of it, essentially that's what it is. That sounds quite cold, but the warmer side of that is that, with our conscious intention and our sort of mindfulness and our ability to visualize and make decisions and think about what we want to have, that's how we program that computer. And that's the really fun part for me of NLP. So the woman the day that went from a big huge no 0 to a 8, we were doing a lot of that work with her of just what was going on in her internal universe and changing it with her visualization and moving it around and making things smaller and bigger and colorful and getting rid of things, and that changes that internal construct for that person, of how they connect with whatever it is that's holding them back.
Yeah, and hypnotherapy is very good to help with that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a trained hypnotherapist. I don't tend to talk about it very much, but I do use, I talk about NLP and IEMT all the time and coaching. But the hypnotherapy for me is the way that I get people into the state that I then do that work with. So, and it's the language that I'm using. But yeah, no, it's very powerful.
Brilliant. We've talked a lot about NLP and ways it helps people. So who can you help? What sort of people can you help?
For me, I mean, I've never had a niche. For me, the clients, it's humans that are stuck in some way, whatever that is, whether it is a chronic illness or whether it's a phobia. I do a lot of phobia work now. I had a lady a couple of weeks ago who had a really severe phobia about sleeping on her own. At the end of 40 minutes, she couldn't remember what the phobia was she'd had at the start of the session, just again because of changing the narrative in her brain. And the brain just takes that on as the new narrative. It doesn't go, no, wait, we don't like sleeping on our own. What are you doing? Like, oh, cool, no, sleeping on her own is fine. Because there was a time before when she was fine sleeping on her own. Something happened. The brain didn't go, no, we're fine sleeping on our own. It's like, oh, sleeping on our own is scary. Got to brace ourselves. This is a horrible thing. That's that narrative. You change it again. So yeah, whether it's something like that, or I get a lot of people coming to me with like imposter syndrome, self-worth issues, confidence lacking of. To my mind, like they still have it. They just don't know they can't find it anymore because it's so buried under lots of life things that happen that aren't so pleasant, and they lose that connection with it. So that's a big thing that I work with. But I also work with people, a 12-year-old kid who couldn't get to school because of such severe anxiety for a few months. And in 2 sessions, he was back in school, with a big smile on his face. But then I work with people who are in a really good place in their life. So I have a principal of a sixth form multi-academy trust who's really excelling, not teaching him how to do his job, but we're just working with his mindset. And what we do just enables him to excel even better so he can have an even more impactful effect on his staff and students. So for me, it's like, if you're a human being and there's something that's either really got you stuck or just a little bit and it just needs tweaking, we have a conversation. That's
Brilliant.
big
Brilliant.
niche.
Yes, very big niche.
For me, that's kind of what it is.
Yeah, because it is that ultimately it's all sort of the same thing, and it's all coming from inside us. So it's
It's literally stories and programs that people have picked up and they're carrying with them, and they're not appropriate for who they are today. It was something when they were 5 or 15, and they're still running that program, but it's something that happened like 30 years ago.
Yeah,
it's not appropriate. Yeah,
fantastic. I know, Alison, you offer a free introductory call. How do they work?
Yeah, I call it discovery call. It's really for the person that wants to talk to me to just get a sense of whether I'd be the right person for them to open up to and work with. I'm always very clear that it's very different. It's not a talking therapy, so we don't go into the difficult stuff enough. We do enough for me to find out what we need to change, but it's really then about really exciting about changing what that is, what that looks like, and then starting to what they want to have instead of what they currently got. So yeah, and in regards to traumas as well, like really difficult things, it just has to for them to make sure that they feel it's going to be a place they can come to and work, and for me too, to make sure I can feel like I can help them. So it can be booked through my website, which is again alisonpetty.com, Alison with 1 L, P for Papa, Echo Tango Tango Yankee.com. There's a book me thing. You just book it there. It's no obligation to carry on. We just have a chat and we just talk a little bit about what's going on with you. I talk about how I think I can help, and then we go from there. It's quite quite very, very chill, very informal.
Well, I will put a link up to that and your website and all your socials and any other ways that people can get in contact with you in the show notes, so that it'll be there for anyone who's listening who wants to get in touch with Alison. And Alison, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity to share the story. I'm always passionate to talk about our beautiful brains and magnificent mindsets.
Yes, and they are quite amazing, aren't they, our brains?
Indeed, yes. No, thank you, Jo. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks so much for listening to this week's show. Check out all the links to the resources mentioned in today's episode and all my freebies in the show notes. See you next time.